people around the country that use the NHS, it's the outcomes that they want to see.
All right, let's move on to something else that's in your manifesto. Let's just show everybody. This is something about the Human Rights Act. You have said we will update the Human Rights Act and administrative law to ensure that there is a proper balance between the rights of individuals and vital national security and effective government. What is the problem you are actually trying to resolve exactly?
Well, in terms of the wider issue about the Constitution, we know that actually Parliament has failed for the last couple of years in terms of constitutional issues, with the Speaker making up the rules as he's gone along. We've got to make sure that...
well, he, of course, would say that he hadn't made up the rules at all, that he was just carrying out his responsibilities. So are you saying that because Parliament did things you didn't like, you are now going to change the Constitution?
I think what's happened is that it's clearly... what we're looking at is going to make sure that we actually work across the board, across Parliament. This is something we don't have a written Constitution. It's not something you just force a change through.
Would you ever think of moving to a system of a written Constitution?
I don't see you wouldn't necessarily need to, but I think...
But you've mentioned areas in British politics over the last year where there's been concerns about interpretation, but if you have a written Constitution agreed from a constitutional convention laid down, like most other countries have, and say, look, we can point to it, it's Article 2, it's Article 8, we're going to repeal that, we're going to look at it. Is it maybe something to look at?
Well, I mean, we'll always look at anything, but I think it's just you can get into a narrow base, frankly, if you have a written Constitution, unless you have something...
But it's good to have clarity.
If you look at America, for example, their Constitution is very, very short, very concise, but then they rely on courts heavily to interpret that Constitution. So you're actually balancing, do you want to shift...
Should judges not interpret the Constitution?
What I'm saying is...
We better have judges interpret politicians.
Do you want to have something that Parliament can actually function as it has for hundreds of years, based on the procedures,
But you've just said Parliament hasn't been functioning over the last couple of years.
Well, I'm talking about the last hundreds of years, but actually what we found is that we've had a really unusual set of circumstances with Brexit and Parliament itself, because of the deadlock within Parliament.
So what are you proposing to do then?
Well, we need to get together actually as a Parliament. This isn't something that we're going to be forcing through.
But you've said we will update the Human Rights Act. And to continue on Neil's line of questioning, what is the problem that you are trying to resolve? What are you proposing?
Well, specifically with the Human Rights Act, one thing that we've been looking at over the last few years or talking about over the last few years, but we've never really had the bandwidth to discuss it, is how we handle our human rights. In terms of the fact that human rights came in and pushed it back to effectively the Council of Europe, and whether we interpret it as we did for the
Why? What's the problem with it? What's the problem, as I say, that you're trying to solve?
This is the debate that we'll have. This is the debate that we'll have.
But why are you having a debate if you can't give me a problem that you're trying to solve?
Because what many people have raised over the last few years is that well, it's been a debate that we've had across the country, and it's been in our last two manifestos about whether we look at actually interpreting our human rights here in the UK, or whether we rely on the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg to
and what's
to
wrong
actually
with the
look
European
at
Court of Human Rights or the European Convention of Human Rights, which is enshrined in the Human Rights Act?
The Human Rights Convention is absolutely fine. We've been signatories to that for many, many years, but it's where we actually do we have a British Bill of Human Rights? Do we have continue with the Human Rights Act that devolves that, that pushes that further
out?
And as I say again,
these have been in previous manifestos. Certainly, when David Cameron was Prime Minister, nothing ever happened on this British Bill of Rights. There may have been some work done on it. But what I'm trying to establish is, what is the problem here? You're proposing potentially sweeping changes to the Constitution, to our relationship with the courts, but you haven't actually suggested why we need to do it.
No, I'm not sure we are proposing sweeping changes that you're talking about. I think what we have is a situation when, as I say, I think everybody looking in Parliament can be sitting there. I've been sitting in the middle of it thinking, what on earth is going on with Parliament just being frozen in a sense of paralysis? Now, that has been partly because of the numbers, clearly. But then there's the interpretations, there's the rush to courts based on some of these sort of things, and this is something that we need to look at sensibly, take a bit of time and look at it.
You understand that without details and flesh on the bone, it can sound a bit sinister. I mean, in fairness, if this was coming from the Corbyn or McDonald side of it, those of us on the right, we're throwing loads of scrutiny on this. What does this mean? What are they playing at? So it's quite reasonable that people ask you.
No, that's fair enough. That's fair enough. But all I'm saying is that this is something for debate, for discussion. It's something that we know there is a problem.
It's weird that it doesn't have any specifics.
Well, because we haven't got a specific proposal that we're pushing forward.
Well, then why are you saying you're definitely going to do it, then?
Because actually, what we need to do, we know there is a problem, that Parliament has been frozen, that Parliament is... the parliamentarians have been rushing to court.
So what's your suggestion? What's your suggestion to deal with the problem as you see it in terms of stalemate in Parliament? What are you... I mean, this is a political decision, isn't it, after the Supreme Court judgment on prorogation, which, of course, you didn't like. You want to stop the likes of people like John Major bringing judicial reviews against the government, don't you?
I think there's a rush to politicising the courts. From some people, some onlookers and some people within Parliament. I don't think that's fair on the judiciary, and I don't think it's appropriate. So it's something that we need to look at. But it's not something that government can rush through. Constitutional matters tend to have a lot of debate, serious debate in Parliament, and it's important that we do bring parties together as best we can for constitutional change. Otherwise, we see
but you don't
when we've
like,
tried laws reform, for example,
you don't like people
frozen.
bringing judicial reviews against the government on decisions made by government. You want to stop it, don't you?
No, I don't think you should. You don't say the judiciary has no role to play in terms of decisions that government make, because it's clearly their role is to interpret the Constitution, albeit unwritten. But there are times when, as I say, when you're looking at things that are unlawful, for example, as the prorogation was decided, that is really quite a subjective matter rather than actually a point of law, because that bit of law didn't actually exist at the time of prorogation.
Would you like to constrain politicians or MPs being able to bring judicial review against government decisions?
I think if you're looking at a government decision that is affecting people, whether it's a change to a particular law, whether it's change to finance or something like that, there's perfectly reasonable to have judicial reviews. I think what I don't want to see, personally, I don't want to see is the politicisation of the courts and the risk that pressure put on courts to feel they are making political decisions rather than matters of law.
Right. What do you say to that, Alison?
Well, I don't think it'd be quite such an issue if some of the rulings had gone the way of the government in the last government, but and it clearly appears to be now that it's become an issue. So,
well, to be fair, I think you're taking a couple of lines and maybe going a little bit too far, because I don't think it's quite as...
Well, this is what you've said. This is what you've said in the manifesto, which is why we're exploring it, because, as Jeff said, there's no detail, there's no information. It's sort of in the manifesto with nothing to explain what it is you're driving at. So we are left guessing.
Well, as I say, I just think that Parliament's failed over the last couple of years. The courts have had pressure on them to feel that they are politicised and acting on politics rather than interpretation of law.
They've managed to do their jobs quite effectively, haven't they? I don't think that they feel there's been too much pressure. They've done their job.
Well, that's a matter of subjection, I think. But yeah.
Well, look, let's move on to Brexit and talk about this in the Financial Times. Boris Johnson's vow to implement